Jesus, my stomach.
Okay, our mics are hot.
Right.
Thank you for coming on the podcast today. For my guest, I guess I'll introduce you today. I have my friend and former coworker named Noel. Noel, would you like to introduce yourself or say a word?
Yes, I am Noel. I'm from New Zealand, and I've been living here in Japan for almost 8 years. And I currently work at an international elementary school as language coordinator.
And Noel, in addition to being a New Zealand expat, do you consider yourself an expat or an immigrant, or do you care about the terminology?
I don't actually think about the terminology.
Okay.
Yeah.
In addition to being a Kiwi living in Japan,
Yeah.
he has also lived in some other parts of the world.
Yeah.
So how many other countries have you lived in proper?
Only just a couple of others. So Korea for 7.5 years, and Russia was a year, and just a number of months in Iceland. Yeah.
You go back to Russia and sort of former Soviet bloc countries pretty regularly, right? Is that a politically incorrect term now? Should I not say former Soviet bloc countries?
No, it's fine.
Okay. You gave me a look like...
Yeah. I think I'm sort of notorious at my job that going back to Russia in particular, people think I'm from Russia.
Yeah. It's an unusual one for people to visit frequently.
Yeah.
I mean, especially where we are. I think a lot more people head south.
Yeah, I have a tendency to avoid the heat.
Yeah.
As much as the weather is good for the most part in Japan, it's extremely hot for me. New Zealand doesn't get that hot or humid. And knowing people in Russia and just the climate being a lot cooler and less humid means I'm a little bit like the royal family. I just want to sort of move north during the summer.
Interesting. Yeah. I could see that. I mean, both times I visited Scandinavia, for example, has been in like late spring or summer, and it's nice. It's funny you say that the weather is mostly nice in Japan, because coming from Southern California, which, as the Japanese would say, does not have 4 seasons. And the Japanese 4 seasons are a bit much for me. I don't know, like this year, winter wasn't that cold, but the summers I find brutally just humid. More than hot, it's the humidity that...
Yeah, it can be very, very exhausting. I think, it's similar in Korea. Obviously, the weather pattern is practically the same. And they have a similar expression with it's the country of 4 seasons.
Oh, really?
But in New Zealand, we often say we have 4 seasons in one day.
That's something that, like, for example, the San Francisco Bay Area.
Yeah.
They also
So it's very changeable weather throughout a given day, and certainly during a week. But it's a lot more comfortable, and you're able to deal with it. Funny that we're talking about weather to start off with.
Yeah, it is. I was just thinking the same thing. It's like starting off the podcast with small talk about...
Yeah.
So the reason I asked you about the countries you lived in was not to discuss their weather patterns, but it was just to get on the topic of language. And so you're also a polyglot. I think of all the people I've had on so far, you probably have the highest overall number of different languages that you speak. So
yeah.
So
it's not too many compared to Europeans, I suppose, but for English speakers,
interesting. Yeah.
The way I imagine it is that the Europeans typically know maybe around the same number, or if not more, languages.
So if you were to rank them in order of your comfort level speaking them or understanding them.
Ooh. Apart from my native language.
You can throw it in there. I assume that's number 1.
I'm going to go number 1. Yeah. English number 1. I guess it depends on what I'm intending to express, but generally I would say Russian, Korean, Japanese, actually.
But so how does what you want to express affect that ranking?
I think it's partly in the way I've learned the languages and the environment I grew up, if you like. I experienced them in different ways, I suppose, and learning them, and at different times of my life. So I feel that my actual ability or comfort level is very different. So for Russian, for example, it makes a lot more sense emotionally, if you like,
Okay.
to me. Whereas I can safely say I still have to think at times about what I want to express in Japanese, and Korean somewhere in the middle.
Okay. Sorry, I'm going to adjust my chair real quick because I'm not going to be comfortable sitting like this.
If that makes sense.
Yeah, I think it does. And I have some thoughts immediately. Granted, I don't know anything about Russian grammar or how the language functions. So there's a lot of just ignorance and assumptions that I'm possibly making. But I'd rather hear what the reason is for you. Because what I initially guess is that East Asian languages have a lot of extra layers to think about in terms of like social hierarchy and level of formality.
Yeah.
Is that what it is?
Oh, for that? Yeah, so at least for Korean, I'm very aware of the levels of formality. With Japanese, yes, but I think it's still not completely natural a language for me, if I'm brutally honest.
Okay, yeah. I think that's fair. No, it's interesting. So in that regard, like my mom's description of her relationship with like Spanish and in English has always been an interesting marker for me, because she describes Spanish as her native language in the sense that it comes out more easily, and it takes less thought, and it's deeper in there. Yeah, it's closer to the roots, whatever, of her thoughts, I guess. But the funny thing is, her English sounds totally native, and no one's aware that she's not a native English speaker. And she even says that she knows more of the English language than she knows of Spanish. 'Cause she left Mexico in elementary school, so there's all sorts of Spanish vocabulary she just doesn't know because she stopped at an elementary student's vocabulary. So I want, when you say that there's a different, for example, emotional relationship, I can totally understand that.
Yeah. So for Russian, I originally went there on exchange as a high school student. In fact, I'd actually finished high school in New Zealand, graduated out, and then I did a year-long scholarship in Russia, outside St. Petersburg. And so there I was living with a family. So the approach, although I was studying by myself every day and I had a tutor as well at school, majority of that time was in a family sort of environment, whereas the other two languages have been at specific language schools.
Okay.
Yeah.
I could see that that's very different.
Yeah, and so I'm sure you're aware, like the focus is very much in those two schools, grammar and building the knowledge very quickly, and it's all a very practical sort of thing.
How much prep study had you done in Russian before going to Russia?
Oh, all I had was a Routledge Teach Yourself Russian book. Yeah, and it's kind of funny because Routledge is a British company, and so the accent guide for how to pronounce Russian words, as I remember, was based on British English, and so I wasn't aware of that at the time, and so I just went ahead and so whenever I would pronounce the basic Russian words that I knew before I started studying it formally, were all based on my accent, so it sounded very, very strange to Russians. It sounded Ukrainian.
Really?
Yeah.
So New Zealand accent is to English as Ukrainian is to Russian. Is that?
Yeah, something like that. Yeah.
That's interesting. So when you say it was based on British English, do you mean like when they would analogize this sound sounds like this sound?
Yeah. So it would be something like the yeah in Russian, the letter, it's written as an E. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Is like the eh sound, I should say, is like eh in 7, whereas in New Zealand we would go 7.
Ah, that's very interesting.
So then I would take that and go, instead of saying like niet,
yeah, no,
I would just go niet,
okay.
So it would sound a little bit different. Yeah, so it sounds kind of funny to Russians.
It's interesting though that rather than hearing that as like a non-native accent, they heard it as Ukrainian.
Yeah,
and that's an interesting.
Well,
thing.
funnily enough, my host family is Ukrainian Russian.
Okay.
Yeah.
So maybe some Ukrainian Russian.
Yeah, some influence in there as well. Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah, it's a bit similar for me, I think, with Japanese, because my first trip to Japan at 14 was exactly like that. I had a little like phrase book that didn't even have any the whole thing was in Romaji. There was no hiragana or katakana even. It was just literally like it would be like in the English sentence like my stomach doesn't feel so good, and then just like in Romaji like onaka ga itai desu, and some, I think even for desu they spelled it without the u to try to like make you say it more like a Japanese person, and that was all I had. And then I stayed with a family here as well. But it wasn't for as long as your homestay was. But it does have a big impact because I mean, still to this day, and I eventually just started leaning into it. But even before I did, people outside of Kansai would really quickly go like, "Oh, you're from Osaka." And
was it the pitch accent as well?
Yeah, and that's a funny one because I consider myself like pretty aware of Japanese. Like I feel like I understand how it works pretty well, but the way the pitch and rhythm and intonation of it works is probably the thing I'm still the least aware of.
Yeah.
Like Japanese people will often say, there's like the ame thing.
Yeah.
Some of them like ame I get, but there's other ones that I'm like I really can't hear the difference. It sounds
on YouTube, there's a guy Dogen.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know him? He's I'm not sure where he lives. Maybe he lives in Kyushu, maybe Oitaken. But he's a pitch accent specialist.
Oh, really?
I guess. Yeah. So he in
Japanese.
Yeah. He's a foreigner.
Okay.
From the States.
Oh.
Yeah, and he does things on YouTube. He actually makes a lot of jokes and sort of comical relief sort of things for like a minute or two. But he also does this pitch accent sort of analysis of Japanese and teaches it.
That's really interesting. I'll have to watch. His name's Dogen?
Yeah, Dogen.
I'll have to check him out. Yeah, there's a few that I constantly get sort of called out on. I think most of the time, even before I've thrown in like a yane or whatever, like someone will say, "Oh, you speak Osaka Ben," but my Osaka friends that know me very well and hear me talk all the time will get comfortable enough to like point out like that sounded a little Kanto just now. And I think with the way I say majide, which is funny because it's a very common thing, I think, especially in Osaka. Like even now I'm aware of the different ways of saying it, but I can't remember which is which or I don't even know which one is the one that I naturally say. But there's like the majide or like majide, like, and I think the second one is more Kansai, but for whatever reason, when I'm speaking naturally, like I don't know which one comes. By the way, for anybody who doesn't know Japanese, that's like the "Are you serious?" basically, and for real, in Japanese. But yeah, intonation stuff. So is there something akin to that in Russian?
So broadly speaking, the accent in Russian is much the same. It's very standardized across the across the country of Russia. Broadly speaking, apart from those who learn it as a second language, of course. So there's very few dialects or anything.
Oh, really?
That are
that's surprising.
Well, I think it probably comes down to the late migration patterns of spreading eastwards and communism. It's sort of government control and standardization of the language. I remember having a conversation with my Russian teacher, actually, who's since passed away, and she was really tough on me, but I admired her by the end. But she asked me why I spoke English incorrectly, and I was like, "What?" And she said, "Well, you should speak the same as everyone else, like British English is what they learn."
Okay.
Yeah, and so she was adamant that there should be no differences between languages. I was like, this is a really strong opinion, quite surprising.
Especially about her non-native language.
Yeah.
As well.
Yeah.
That's very interesting, and it kind of relates to a topic that my last guest who was on here, my friend Kevin, we talked a little bit about differing philosophies on like code switching, for example. Yep. That I tend to be on the weirdly conservative side of where I feel like if you're speaking in English, you ought to speak in English, and if you're speaking in Japanese, for example, you ought to speak in Japanese. Yeah. And I when we worked together at the school, and I was teaching in the junior high school, I often would sort of, when the students would code switch, which is perfectly natural for bilingual, especially children, to use whichever word feels more comfortable in that moment from whatever language that they know. I would always kind of tell them, you may understand, like, I can't even think of an example they would always say, but like, they'd mix Japanese and English in a sentence. I mean, you may understand that, and all your classmates may understand that, but when you go speak to the average English speaker, the average Japanese speaker, that's not necessarily a language that anyone understands. So I'd always try to make them stay in the lane of whatever language. Even if you're speaking Japanese in English class, which you shouldn't be doing in English class, I would at least speak Japanese. Yeah. Or if you're speaking English, speak English. My friend Kevin was saying that one of his earliest experiences living in Japan was basically always hanging out in the bar of this hotel in Nagasaki, where there was like German engineers, I think, for some plant that they had there. And then the English teachers and then the Japanese people who hung out there, and they just kind of had their own language. And I think that, from a lot of multilingual communities, code switching becomes part of the identity of it.
Yeah, I think that's a feature of some international schools, including the one where I'm currently employed.
Yeah.
For better or worse, but it is it is a feature.
Yeah, but so it's interesting. So that I'm not as extreme as your former teacher. I kind of, there's a part of me that's like, I feel where she's coming from, but at the same time, she's totally wrong.
So I'd never had to think about accent so much. The only thing I really thought about the New Zealand accent before, when I was a kid, when I was growing up, was that the TV would speak American. The TV would sound a certain way.
Yeah.
And the only time you'd really hear a New Zealand accent would be on the news, the local news, or on the few shows that we had, So I wasn't really aware of it. As I said, like I went to the country with my book in hand, and my pronunciation was based on my accent.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I think, I quickly corrected that, and when I went to Russia, so I think it was like August 1997, I pushed myself pretty hard. So we had a meeting with our regional group of exchange students in December, and some students, like the German students, already knew Russian. The girl from Switzerland already knew Russian and a multitude of other languages, which made me look bad. I'd picked up Russian pretty quickly, to the point where the other students were kind of surprised. So I was happy with that achievement, and it was just a matter of working on pronunciation and things after that.
So which skill came to you first? So was that your first foreign language then, was Russian?
No, like a lot of people in English-speaking countries, perhaps outside the States, I learned French first.
Okay.
So I did 5 years of French in high school.
Really?
But the education system for languages is not so emphasized.
Okay.
Apart from English and Maori, our native language.
We don't have to get into it right this second, but I also wanted to talk to you a bit about the role of Maori in New Zealand society as well, because I think that's very interesting. It's something that probably a lot of people don't know about.
Yeah.
But we can come back to that.
So French, as I said, for 5 years, but that was, I think, probably a few periods a week. So my ability was okay, and by the graduating class, I was the only student still doing French, but I don't count it as one of my languages because it's somewhere in the back, and I don't use it. I really can't operate in it.
Really? I mean, so for example, there's French teachers at the school where you work now. If there's a conversation happening nearby in French, does it feel any different than any other foreign language you don't know, or are you able to pick up some of it? Or
I mean, there are a large number of similarities to English. So
sure.
Yeah. So safely I'd say no. Okay. I wouldn't.
All right. Okay.
But the interesting thing about French is that learning the grammar, at least trying to understand it, because it was obviously a whole new concept. Yeah. I didn't understand English grammar at that point during high school.
Yeah.
And it was only once I got to learning Russian grammar, so it has a case system, and I had to really think about English and where English was coming from, and the French basis, the French study had helped with that as well. So it was sort of an auxiliary.
I'm not sure if I'm just not familiar with the term, or if it's that I don't speak any languages that have a case system, but what is that? What is a case system?
A case system is, certain languages like Russian and Latin is another famous one, where instead of having sort of individual words for a function, so for example, the genitive in English, we use of or apostrophe s, for example. So in Russian, that would mean changing the ending of the word. So each
of the modified word or the modifying word, like,
well, it can be
like, for example, Noel's hat.
Yeah.
Sorry, that's where my eyes went. Noel's hat, is that like Noel changes or hat changes?
Noel changes.
Oh, okay.
Because one would be the subject, which is a separate case.
Yeah.
Nominative case, and then the other would be in the genitive. Yeah.
So that means the nouns change. In kind of doing the similar function to what particles do in Japanese.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
So there are some like prepositions in Russian as well. So in Japanese they are postpositions.
Right.
But So that has its. They belong to different cases, but there is also a prepositional case as well in Russian.
Okay.
Yeah, particularly for location. Yeah.
So is it, in a sense, then it's like the nouns get inflected, or
yeah.
Okay.
Well, not just nouns, but nouns, adjectives, numbers.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and of course, like a lot of European languages, you have to conjugate the verbs anyway,
Right.
depending on the person and number.
Right.
And for Russian, also verbs conjugate in gender as well.
Oh, wow! Even verbs
For past tense. Yeah. So it was very, very complicated thing to learn and sort of get my head around, but it helped me understand English and that little basis of French there, particularly with conjugations, was useful to learn Russian and then move on to other languages because you can kind of relate it. The thing with cases is what's interesting is word order is a lot freer in Russian than in English.
Really?
So it doesn't. Although the emphasis, the focus, what you intend to mean changes depending on where you put the words,
right.
You have a lot more freedom of where to put them.
Yeah, I think this is a very anecdotal, just kind of maybe assumption that I'm making, but I have the feeling that word order in English is probably one of the most emphasized structures compared to other languages. Yeah. No other language that I know of cares about it as much as English does. that I know of, right? So let's see. Oh, so you talked about something that sorry, my lack of graceful segue there was
take a sip of coffee.
Just figuring this stuff out. No, you mentioned an experience I think that is extremely common and I think familiar to anyone who has learned a foreign language or more than one foreign language, and that is that the first foreign language you learn always sort of teaches you your own language as well, and it teaches you how language itself works. You sort of learn how to learn a foreign language in the first one, and I think that it makes the second, third, whatever, maybe not easier, especially if they're not the same, but like in my case, I had a similar thing where I had studied Spanish, and I grew up in a home where Spanish was spoken to an extent. I studied Spanish in school, but I never really I never really mastered verb conjugation. It was the exact kind of learning that as a student I hated. I hated memorizing things just for the sake of memorizing. I always wanted to know like the why or the reason. And I think one of the big problems with a lot of European languages is that in addition to having the conjugation system itself, there's also a ton of exceptions to that system, which is one of the things that when I learned Japanese, for example, it felt like if there was a language that was designed for how my brain worked and how I learned language, Japanese was perfect because once you get the rules, it pretty much almost always follows the rules. There's not a ton of exceptions, especially in the way standard Japanese is spoken.
I think that's something very interesting about language for me is the rules. So I said, as I've said to you earlier today, like I have a lot of like grammar and reference books, and these are the things I like to read through, and I'm fascinated by the rules and the exceptions as well. I think what's interesting is this, the rule book, if you like, mirrors the rules for living in a country. So for I've lived here almost 8 years, and living in Korea previously, like people would, foreigners at least, of course, over the years, people would say that they're frustrated. They don't understand how things are in this country or whatever. And for me, for the most part, I think I've had like a pretty easy ride. I've never really struggled. And I'm not saying it's not because of the language, but I think I've come to understand that it's just a matter of learning the cultural rules, the societal rules. And once you know those, and in Korea especially, there's a lot of rules. In Japan too. Once you know those rules, you can sort of better prepare yourself, and you just sort of fit into society a little bit better. So it's somewhat similar to the grammar, I guess.
It's a very interesting point that you make there, and I think it makes me think of like the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, and the idea that our thoughts are structured by the languages that we speak, or whatever our first language is. And there's definitely a parallel there. I mean, I think in a sense, learning the dominant language of a country is one of the cultural rules that you learn. And if you understand it, there's a lot more situations where something might happen and you might see like people form a bond or someone be offended where you understand exactly why it happened in a way that maybe someone who doesn't, whether it's the language or some other aspect of the manner etiquette of the country, they might not understand why.
Yeah.
I could see that for sure.
Yeah. I've had one particular conversation I can recall with a foreigner. She said, for example, she was on the train, and this is unrelated to language, but she was on the train, and no one would give up their seat for the elderly person that was standing.
Mm-hmm.
And so back home,
Yeah.
that would sort of be the done thing, right? Like you would, I see this older person standing.
That's a common one in Japan as well.
Yeah.
That a lot of people from outside of the country complain about.
Right, and in my experience, I sort of understood it a little bit differently. Like I knew that back home we would feel obliged to do that, and I would do that.
Mm-hmm.
But I felt like here, the rule that I feel is true is that you don't necessarily want to embarrass the other person either.
Yep.
So I felt that was the overriding rule, perhaps for a lot of people. Of course, it might be people that just are ignoring it anyway.
Yeah.
But like that is an additional consideration, and I felt like that person, that foreigner, didn't think about that, like, and invalidated that, in fact.
Sure, there's a tendency to, for example, if you're feeling offense or frustration, to just latch onto the feeling of frustration and not look for anything that might complicate your frustration, right? If there's anything that might mitigate it and make you stop and go, well, maybe this isn't as bad as I'm seeing it as being, that tends to be ignored. I mean, I think that one thing we're seeing from like living in internet society is that people very much like to feel offended and outraged. Like there's a certain aspect of that people almost, it becomes addictive. And I think like, the cultural frustrations of living in a foreign country are part of that. I'm sure we've probably even had some of the same conversations with the same people separately, even about those sorts of things. Yeah, I've always heard, like in Korea, and you can maybe verify or refute this, but like in Korea, I've heard it's very taboo for young people to sit in the priority seats on a train, even if the train's not that crowded. That people will leave the chairs for, there's the seats for pregnant women or handicapped people or elderly people, and they're in it pretty much every country. But in Japan, people will just sit in those. If the train's crowded, like anyone will just sit in them. It's a seat, and the assumption is that, well, if someone needs it, they'll get up and let them have it. But oftentimes that doesn't actually even happen here, which is what you're referring to, and why I say it's a common situation that gets complained about. But I've heard that Korean people it's in Korean society, it's much more taboo to sit in them to begin with if you're well. So they often get left empty, which then eliminates the need for any awkward interaction if somebody does need them because they're available. And I've heard that in Korea, if you see people sitting in those seats, they're Japanese.
I can't speak to the Japanese part, but generally, as I said, like the rules are very strict, at least from a Western perspective, I would say. And so it sort of proves my point, I guess. Like once you know that rule, you know not to break it. Basically. So if you're not going to break that rule, you can probably live a bit more comfortably. You just stay in your lane, I guess. Not always comfortable for every Westerner, of course.
No, yeah. And the funny thing is, too, I think that and maybe this is a good thing to note while we're talking about this topic. This is a topic that often gets framed in a way that Asian societies have more rules or are more restrictive. And I think that what often gets missed, the sort of forest for the trees thing, is that we, especially, I'm going to say probably especially Americans, it may apply to the entire Anglosphere, I don't know, that we tend to regard our own culture as like so default and so like just the natural way of human existence that we don't even notice how we're enculturated, or we don't even notice our own rules sometimes. And it's interesting because as when you live in a foreign country, especially like in our jobs where we have worked in the capacity of literally preparing people to speak English as a second language, preparing people for interactions abroad. Like you said about language rules, it also makes you more aware of your own culture's rules.
Yes, yeah.
And I've definitely, the more distance I get from American culture and the more I think about it from the perspective of someone not from it, someone from a place like Japan, I'm able to see things that are not super obvious, that, we regard as being pretty straightforward and obvious, that are really not.
Yeah, I think, I agree with your point there on thinking that the Western world is in some way one whole thing, and it's the international view of the world and it's the basis for all modern society. Well, it's not. So yeah, as much as I'm talking about the rules of Asian countries as well, I don't want to overemphasize it, I suppose. Yeah.
Well, like an example, and I'd be interested to hear. I would be interested to hear anything about Russia about this too. But an example I'll give about, like, say, Mexico, for example. This is not something that's can come across through audio because it involves a gesture. But in English speaking countries, but we talked earlier before we got on the mic about how Asian people beckon someone over. In English speaking countries, your palm is up and you're hooking with the fingers towards yourself, and in Asian countries, your palm is down. You're sort of sweeping inward with your fingers. That's one example of something that's not language, but is part of the cultural language, I guess.
Right.
But so in Mexico, when you're talking about the height of someone, in English, we do the flat palm down, like almost like you're doing a salute with your hand, and just like, he's this tall, or the table's about this tall, or whatever. In Mexico, there's 3 different gestures, and I believe it's the whole Spanish-speaking world, but I'm not 100% sure about that. Where if it's a inanimate object, like a table or a piece of furniture or a bush, you use the same one as English speakers do, but that's only for inanimate objects. So something that obviously Mexican people are aware that it's not the same in other countries, so they don't like freak out about it. But it's rude in Mexico to say, like, oh, I think my son's about this tall. You're basically implying that he's an inanimate object, right? That he's not a human. And so for humans, it's one finger like this, and it's typically not horizontal, but it's vertical. It's like pointing. The tip of your finger is how tall they are.
Yeah.
And then I think also, this is one I have not as much cause to use, but for like animals, it's usually 2 fingers.
Oh wow. Okay.
Yeah. And that's one that's like, I think most Americans probably would make the default assumption, like, oh, Japan is a very strict traditional country with all sorts of mysterious social protocols that are dangerous to violate, and probably broadly to East Asia and maybe even parts of Southeast Asia, for example, like the Thai not showing the bottom of the foot thing and not touching people's heads. That tends to be the assumption of Asian societies, I think, from Western perspective. But if you mention Mexico, I think the average American's assumption is like, oh, anything goes there, like it's totally free, and like which is actually not the case. I mean, the point I'm trying to make is that I don't even know that societies have more or less rules. They just have different rules.
Right. Yeah. And it's just for me, I guess, on this journey through life, it's a matter of I like to know things more than anything else. I'm basically a know-it-all, as I've been told. But yeah, so whether it's news, whether it's languages, whether it's cultures and things, I just like to find out stuff. I don't know if I necessarily do much with that information, but I'm just naturally nosy like that, I suppose. Yeah. So that's actually really interesting. I wouldn't have thought about that with the
I think I'm the same way, and
gestures.
Information, if you think of it as like tools in a kit, right? You don't always know. I think so. People like you and I who maybe approach it from what's interesting first, not necessarily what's going to be useful or what I will profit from in the future. Yeah. I think that we tend to discover that you don't actually know. There's not a reliable way to predict. I mean, granted, there's certain things like, probably if I learned computer science, I would make more money than I'm making right now. There's certain aspects of learning or knowledge that you can approach it that way. And I meet people with personalities that are more that way, right? Is this important? Is this valuable information? If not, I don't care. Right. I don't want to learn it. But you don't always know.
Yeah. I could jump
please.
back. It's interesting when you were talking before about when you were talking about pitch accent, and you were saying like people might question you or otherwise about how you've pronounced a word. Mm-hmm. My experience between Korea and Japan, even for their opportunity to use the language, it's always been quite different. So in Japan, whenever I used to travel here frequently from Korea on breaks, people would always come, and this is before I learned Japanese, people would come, when I interact with people, they would speak Japanese to me without me knowing. They would have to sort of bumble through and I'd speak English because I didn't know Japanese at all then. And then, but in Korea, the experience was always very different. People would speak to me, approach me in English, whether that was perfect English or fumbled English or whatever. But the mentality was really different. It was like a pressure to use the English than you in Korea, whereas in Japan, people were more comfortable using Japanese with me, which I actually respected. I enjoyed that. It was welcoming.
To be spoken to in Japanese.
Yeah, although I did not understand it,
Yeah.
but it was coming from environment in Korea where I'd learned the language over several years, formally and everything, and still people would come and feel that they had to speak to me in English.
That's very interesting to me, and it's maybe something we could talk more about, because obviously I never lived in Korea. I've visited twice, but
oh yes, I've heard about those trips.
Oh, really? No, nothing remarkable happened. I literally, one of them I stayed in Hongdae the entire time and just like walked around and window shopped and drank coffee. What I was going to say about that is it's interesting that you describe Korea as more, I don't know if you'd call it alienating, but it's definitely otherizing, right? To be visually identified as foreigner and as a foreigner, and then be spoken to in what they just immediately assume must be your native language, which in this case it is, even though you have the ability to speak Korean.
Yes.
I've never experienced that in Korea.
Oh.
I don't speak Korean, and I've never lived in Korea, so obviously those are two huge differences in our experiences. But I've experienced that a ton in Japan, so it's very interesting to have you describe it about Japan. Yeah. Although I will say I can see comparatively that there probably is a difference, because in Japan, early on when my Japanese was not, I wasn't able to produce it as quickly. It took a little bit more, like I had kind of a running start into a conversation before I could confidently rattle stuff off. Now it's easier compared to then to sort of muscle through when someone's insisting on speaking to me in English, and we're already like we've exchanged 5 sentences in Japanese. Yeah. I've established that I can speak Japanese. It's gotten faster to get through that, where they'll settle in and they'll go like, oh, okay, he speaks Japanese. I'll stop trying to speak to him in English. But
that's fascinating, because it's literally the opposite for me. I could probably count on one hand how many times it's happened to me in Japan, and really? Those have been in shops, for example, probably like in tourist places or something. But it's a feature of life in Korea, to be honest. To be fair, I mean, the number of language learners are quite different, right?
Yeah.
Those who learn Korean are very few relatively, and traditionally, at least in the last few decades, Japanese was always the more studied language. It's changing now.
Yeah, I mean, K-pop has changed that a lot.
Yeah.
I think since Gangnam Style became popular, and probably a bit before that, it really has exploded. And Japan before that had anime and video games, right. And then also kind of samurai movies and martial arts culture were sort of niche things that some people were into. But
like when I studied Korean at Yonsei University, the school was large, and most of the students were actually Japanese. When I went back to visit a few years ago to the language school itself, it had like doubled in size. It was huge, and far more students from all over the world were learning Korean. But didn't change my experience, I suppose, of everyone feeling the need for using English first. And I think that certainly colored my perception of living there, I would say. So the experiences of living in Korea versus living here are different. And I mean, you know me well. I'm quite a private person. I'm not the most social. I don't think I'm completely antisocial, but I think I'm quite comfortable being by myself and
you don't need to get the hit constantly.
No, I get that from the news. Trump.
So it's interesting because my very first year living in Japan, my first 2 years really, I was way out in the countryside. I was in Gunma Prefecture for my first year, and I was working my very first job. I did not have any idea how someone found a job in a foreign country or started a life that way. So I literally just in America like Googled and went off hearsay and found a company that placed teachers as assistant language teachers in Japanese public schools, and that was my first gig. And it was not the experience I wanted, because I always wanted to end up in Osaka, and if I could have designed my life, I would have probably just like come to Osaka for a couple of years.
That's interesting. Why did you pick Osaka?
My host family was in Osaka. When I stayed here as a teenager, it was in Osaka. And then in subsequent trips, I had discovered that the Japan that I loved was actually Osaka. Because I came to Osaka 3 times before I ever visited anywhere else. And then when I went to Tokyo, it wasn't completely conscious in the beginning, but I started to be aware of like, oh, this is not the same culture. It's a little different. Anyway, but Gunma was very nice and people were very friendly there. And its countryside life is a bit slower, which I think lets people be a bit more open-minded and friendly. And they were very welcoming and kind. But at the same time, they did not have a ton of experience meeting anyone who wasn't Japanese. Right. I mean, anyone who wasn't Japanese, and I'm including like other East Asian countries in there, but especially foreigners. And, you know, the ALT job exists in pretty much every town in Japan. So there always is like the resident one Western person, right?
Yeah.
that they see and they're used to, but you're known by everybody. Like,
yeah. My first experience in Korea, I was straight out of university, and I scored a job in the countryside. Well, what in Korea is considered the countryside. I moved to a city called Cheongju, and it's I think it was like 600,000 people. So in New Zealand, that would make it the second biggest city, but in Korea, it's just it's just an everyday city. But the majority of us foreigners who were teaching English in Hagwon and things were we all lived on one street or one street over, but most of us lived on the same street in this new subdivision sort of neighborhood. Even though we didn't necessarily teach there, no.
Okay.
But it was just where they put the local Hagwon bosses or whatever decided to put people. So we were just like, oh, huddled. Yeah. So it was an unusual first year. It made things quite interesting. Yeah. So.
Interesting.
Yeah, and I spent like that first year. I actually spent a lot of time. I kept journals of my experience, and I spent a lot of the rest of the time studying as well. So before I went off to language school there in Seoul, I actually was studying by myself first anyway. No. So I always felt a pressure to do that kind of thing. Yeah.
Yeah. So in my case with Gunma, I think one thing that was very different was like the countryside people. That's a huge generalization I'm making there. But I think the experience of people in Gunma and the way it contributed to the way they reacted to me, even just as a stranger on the street, was very different than Osaka. And it actually was a little bit, for me, disheartening, disappointing, because there was a lot of experiences. Sometimes were even positive. People would be more interested in me because I was a foreigner and like really want to talk to me and like take me around to like cool spots to drink or whatever. Yeah. And that's nice. There was no ill intent there, but I felt really super like an alien. Like I cannot just be a person here. I cannot just blend in. And in Osaka, I had not felt that way.
I was going to ask you that. Yeah.
Yeah. In Osaka, I mean, of course, I was still a foreigner, right? And I was still foreign to people, but they're not as blown away by the fact that you're a white person, right? Which is so that there's two things going on there, and I think that it speaks to sort of the experience that Westerners expect when they come to Japan. Some people want to come and be like Tom Cruise in The Last Samurai, and just have every experience be about the fact that they are not Japanese, but they are in Japan. That's like some people's whole theme of their experience here is just like, if the conversation's gone 15 minutes without acknowledging the fact that they are foreign, they have to like reintroduce it somehow to the conversation. And I always really super didn't want that. And there's people in America that would sort of like, America can be weird about racial identity and cultural identity, but would sort of like remind me like, they're never going to see you as Japanese, man. And I'm like, well, I'm not Japanese, so that's accurate, right? I'm not planning to like become something else, but I just wanted to be a person, right? Like, if your racial or cultural identity is part of who you are as you walk around, but you also just want to be a person. Yeah. And Gunma, I really never felt able to do that. So in Gunma, I a lot more had that experience of people just kind of like speaking. I mean, literally, sometimes if you're out at night and you're in an area where there's like people drinking, literally from like across the street at a stoplight, you'll have like some slightly drunk salarymen just going, hello, "Haro!" like across the street at you, and it's just like, oh man.
Maybe Kobe is a lot friendlier because I haven't had that in Kobe.
I think Kobe. So in Kansai, among Kansai natives, there's a huge division between the culture of, say, like Osaka, Kyoto, Kobe, and Nara, and Osaka's like the wild, crazy one. I think Kobe have the reputation for being the most sophisticated and worldly, and I think it's a point of pride for Kobe people that they don't gawk at foreigners. They don't care.
I've felt nothing but welcomed there, and when I say welcomed, I mean to the point that you're making before, like it wasn't a big deal that you're a foreigner either way.
Yeah.
Like, oh, fantastic, or oh, terrible. It was just okay. Yep.
Yeah.
So it's been interesting.
And actually, we could talk a little bit about where that comes from. Where I feel that some of it comes from is that when Japan ended the period of Sakoku, which is when the country was closed for hundreds of years to anyone leaving or coming. I mean, like, the punishment for leaving Japan was death, and people were not allowed to visit. That Kobe was the first port when that ended. Of course, there was Dejima and Nagasaki during that time, but people couldn't actually come into Japan. There was like a little, basically, fortress island that they were allowed to trade within. But Kobe was it was really the first open port, and the first mansions of like diplomats and stuff from foreign countries that are in Kobe.
Yeah, I went hiking just on Saturday actually, and it's one of my favorite things to come back through the mountains and then come down. And I sort of just find a random path usually, and come back down to my nearest station or to my place. And I usually pass like a bunch of those really nice old mansions.
Kitano,
Kitano, and even further over, actually in Mikage, there's some really big places.
Really?
Yeah, that's amazing.
And it's very interesting because so my experience, as I told you, I'd been at Osaka many, many times before I went anywhere else in Japan. And as close as Kobe is, Kobe was one of the last places that I visited. And it was really weird for me to get off the train and be like, oh, this is San Francisco. There's all the Victorian houses on hills and stuff. It just felt very weirdly like San. And also the fact that I think it's hilly and the ocean's right there.
Right. It's a very narrowly placed sort of city. It's only, a few kilometers wide, I guess. Yeah, so it's like stretched out. Yeah,
Kobe's super interesting city. I mean, it's something I think maybe this is not being like a geography podcast. We don't have to talk about it too long, but it is a city that anyone, if you've never visited it, it's a narrow strip of land crammed right between the ocean and mountains. It basically existed because I think at that point it was the best place to situate a port relative to Osaka and Kyoto, right?
Yeah. And it's actually a really good place from Rokko-san to look out over Osaka.
Yeah.
Especially at night, but during the day it's amazing as well. And there's tons of hikes. The signage is terrible. But as long as you know where the sea is, you can always find your way back. So
the point being, I think it's a point of pride for like historically for Kobe people to not, because it is a little bit people who are from a society where there is a degree of multiculturalism and migration and stuff. We do tend to get like, we regard otherizing people too much as almost like provincial. Right? If you're like, oh wow, I mean, I've seen it in places in America that I'm what I'm saying is not super nice, so I'm actually not going to name the place that I was. But I've been to states in America, not in the deep South either. But
could you just mime it? So I can.
It's one of the square ones near the top, near Canada.
Oh right.
In the sort of the western Midwest there, or eastern West, whatever you call it.
Okay. Nicely done.
But I've been there, and at the time I was with family, and the girl I was dating at the time, this was a very, very long time ago, went with me, and she was
that's a whole other podcast there.
Yeah, she was a Korean American, and I saw her have, and this is someone who was born in America. It wasn't even like she was a foreigner. I saw her have the experience in that town that I have since had many times in Japan. Of like people, strangers on the street just stopping and staring, and literally one shop that we went into, we were just killing time. Walked in and poked around and didn't end up buying anything, but there was like one shop staff at the counter who just had nothing to do and like chatted with everyone who came in. Even said to us, "You're the first Asian person I've seen in real life." Like said that to her, which if people, I think we kid ourselves that that doesn't exist anymore, but it totally does. And again, it didn't come from a place of malice. There was no. They were fascinated by that thing, that difference that they didn't have so much experience to. So I forgot exactly where I took the turn into that story there, but
it's funny because I mean, you're coming from the States, whether you like it or not, everyone has an idea about Americans, whether it's true, whether it's accurate or not. Coming from New Zealand is a lot smaller. It's sort of distant. It's sometimes left off maps. The globes completely.
Famous thing about New Zealand.
So when I've traveled, I've been to Scandinavia a few times. I've been to the Arctic more recently. People don't know how to act when you say you're from New Zealand, except to say, "Oh, okay, it's far away." It's cool. I like it. I mean, typically there's no sort of prejudgment or anything.
Yeah, blank page is a great place to start, I think.
These days people mostly know Lord of the Rings or something like that. And
that's it's interesting that it's Lord of the Rings, because I think that shows how a lot of that branding that ends up happening starts with like boards of tourism and stuff making these decisions. For better and for worse. So since you bring that up, I think it's a good segue.
We can talk about Lord of the Rings, are we?
Yes. I want to. We're going to talk about Elvish for the next 30 minutes. Maori. You've told me not a huge amount of things, but you've shared some stories and some tidbits with me before about the role of Maori in New Zealand schools and New Zealand society, and also the sort of unique relationship that the Maori people have with the post-colonial government, or I don't know what you want to call it, the English-speaking government of New Zealand, and how it's unique among, I think, all of the relationships between these British colonial governments and their native populations. Certainly very different than the Native Americans in the U.S. and the indigenous people in Australia, as well as Aboriginals. I don't know if that's the term anymore. I'm not from that part of the world, so I apologize.
Yeah, I couldn't say for Australia if it's. I believe it's still Aboriginals.
Okay. Yeah. I just feel like every word that I learned in elementary school is no longer the word that I should be using, and so I'm always hesitant to. Yeah. Okay. So could you talk about that? The role of the both the language and how did it end up that way? And
okay, so given that we're on an audio podcast, I'll readily admit that I'm Pākehā, which means that I'm a New Zealander of European descent. So I will openly say that some of the things I might say might not be completely accurate.
I appreciate that. That's fair.
And I'm sure you'll get feedback from people if it's completely wrong. Where to begin? So the relationship, the one that is taught to us in history class and through schools, is generally one where there was a history of poor race relations, but sort of since the 1970s, 80s, there's been a deliberate move by the government to improve those relations. And that includes respecting our founding document, which is the Treaty of Waitangi. Waitangi being the place where the treaty was signed, first signed between different Māori iwi, or tribes around the country. It sort of moved around the country, several different documents, but they're all called the treaty. So it was a neglected document from 1840, and it's a very poorly written legal document, and of just sort of 3 clauses basically, but it gave guarantees to Māori in terms of citizenship, in terms of self-determination, and in terms of treasures, taonga, so things that are important culturally and economically and socially to Māori. I'm making this as a very simple sort of discussion here. Sure. But basically that was neglected for the longest time during the colonial era and up until...
Neglected in what sense?
It was basically ignored. Literally you can see the document and it's been written away by... You can literally see the document and it's been eaten away by rats over the years. Wow. So it's just sort of this hodgepodge piece of paper. However, so now it's... The aim of every government, they say, is to respect and promote Māori rights and their treasures and self-determination to whatever degree that government in power actually believes at that time. Generally, I think the New Zealand population's very respectful of it, very aware of it. We're aware of experiences in American history. We study it in school in terms of the Native American population, First Nations in Canada, and so forth. So we kind of, I guess most New Zealanders feel like, to a certain degree, we have bragging rights. I don't know if that's completely fair. But yeah, so part of the treasures, things to be preserved and promoted, are things like language in there. So students in primary school learn just basic Māori, and then there's the option to go further with it into intermediate, high school, and even specialist universities now. Yeah, so it's a national language.
Just as a quick aside, and I want to come back to that, you referred to the founding document of New Zealand, and I think that I want to just highlight for the benefit of probably American or British listeners that this is the equivalent of what in the U.S. would be like the Constitution, or in the U.K. I was always taught in American schools that the Magna Carta was this massive, but apparently British people say that it's not, or that's not culturally regarded that way.
Okay.
I don't know what's true, but in any case, that New Zealand does not have a constitution. Yeah. That is the document that founded the country.
Right. We do not have one codified formal document that's a constitution. So there's only a few countries like that. One being the UK, New Zealand, and Israel. Are the countries that don't have a single codified constitution. Yeah. So that's as good as we get, basically, in New Zealand. And the ambiguity is rife throughout it, I would say, throughout the treaty. But I think it's overall to the benefit of New Zealand society that it's open to interpretation. Yeah. So I quite enjoy the fact that we have a native language that is increasingly becoming respected within the country. Of course, there are, like any former colonial country, there's a lot of opinions about that. Mm-hmm. Like one being, for example, well, it's a language that's only useful, if at all, in New Zealand. So why should my children learn it? You know, of course, I think probably you and I probably have very different similar perspectives, but very different from that idea. Right. That there is value in learning a language, no matter what it is, for the sake of that language.
Oh, and I my guess would be, because this always conveniently seems to be the case, that the people who for some reason feel that it's not useful or valuable, or coincidentally English is their native language.
Yeah, that's something. That's notorious among the English-speaking countries. I think, right?
Yep. There's a massive inbuilt, just baked in arrogance to being a native English speaker that we
and the irony, I guess, in us having this conversation is that we have been employed as English teachers in foreign countries to spread our language, if you like.
I have a lot of mixed feelings about that. I mean, we could really get into the sort of sociopolitics and the historical hegemonic role of English that I don't love that aspect of it.
So I think in New Zealand, so particularly since 1970s and from the 80s, New Zealand identity, broadly speaking, has been more inclusive of a bicultural identity before. Actually, as a slight aside, when I was doing postgraduate studies in New Zealand, I had to do some kind of research. And so I decided to research currency in New Zealand, the dollar, and before that it was a New Zealand pound. So New Zealand dollar and New Zealand pound. And the designs of those dollars and coins, and how they'd changed through time. And it was very interesting because you could literally map out the empire being up front and everything, and important in the imagery of the money, of the currency, and then that would change to something where it was just the Queen in the 1960s, and it was very simple designs, and then slowly the inclusion of Maori motifs and koru and different designs and things, through to now where it's the each banknote is very colorful, very different. It has Maori a language and traditional designs all over it. It's shifted quite a lot. And in that research, actually, when they decided in the 1960s, so 1967, they switched over to the dollar decimal. They I went through the archives, the National Archives in Wellington, and there were actually records there of why they chose certain designs in the past. So they would choose like Maori currency coins, because there was one of a warrior, and he was pointing his spear from left to right, so he's pointing rightwards, and it literally said to show Maori the way. So they designed this coin of a lower denomination with the idea that they would help promote Maori.
Right.
And so there's a very different mentality from today, where we're hopefully a little bit more respectful.
It inevitably, I think those first steps are often very fraught. I mean, I always think of the fact that America, while certain language has certainly been, I think we're all on the same page that certain language is not respectful. I think there's a frequent like pendulum shift, or even different people seem to feel, and I'm not speaking as a member of the group, but just having talked to people and heard people's views, that like, is African American the better term, is Black the better term, and right, that there's a certain tenuousness to some of that stuff. It's probably good that it's in flux. I think it makes people feel a bit uneasy and uncomfortable talking about it, but I think it's good to work it out.
Yeah, I think what I'm about to say is probably a bit contentious, but just in my own sort of observations, when I was growing up as a kid in the 80s, and hearing the New Zealand, as I said to you before, hearing New Zealand accent on TV was relatively unusual, except for a certain number of programs.
Yeah.
That's obviously changed quite a lot now and things. But one aspect that has changed, at least in my mind, and I'm welcome to people saying I might be wrong, but that the pronunciation of Maori in English,
Maori words, or the
Maori words
okay.
Used in English,
Okay.
has increased, which I think is great. But the pronunciation as well has also altered. So in the past, if there were a Maori word, so even the word Maori before, perhaps my grandparents, for example, might offend some people, but might say something like Mary.
Okay.
So something like that.
Yeah.
And you might still hear that in the very older generations. I'm not quite sure, but now I'm very aware of how I should speak.
Yeah.
When it comes to Maori words, and that I can utilize that vocabulary as well. The little vocabulary that I do know, to be honest. I don't speak the language in any great extent.
So is that, do people cringe or wince when they hear Maori?
Today, yes, I think so. Yeah, unless it's hard to say, but I wouldn't be surprised if the region I'm from, in the deep south of New Zealand, sort of in the more Pākehā, so the white or European New Zealand dominant areas, perhaps maybe a little bit more traditional. I mean, it might be changing. I haven't lived in New Zealand for a number of years now.
That's very interesting, and it goes back to what I was saying before about code switching versus speaking a quote, I hate this term, but like pure version of the language. Is I very consciously, when I'm speaking English, don't say karaoke or karate. I say like karaoke and karate, like, because I'm speaking English, and those are words which have become English to an extent. Yeah. And when I'm speaking Japanese, of course, I pronounce them the Japanese way. But when it becomes an issue like that, I think that's a very different choice.
Right. It's because it can potentially reveal your political beliefs or
it's a shibboleth, right?
Yeah. Your affiliations with a particular movement, if any, and however people might feel about that. For me, I feel it's just being a responsible citizen of the country, I guess. Yeah,
I agree with you. I think that sometimes the idea of political correctness, quote unquote, is it gets blown up into a bigger concept than it really is. I think it really just comes down to like, if it's no trouble to not hurt somebody, why would you choose to ignore that? Why would you? So